Irrespective of your views on the games themselves, nobody can deny that Nintendo has put a lot of time and treasure into trying to give Metroid Prime a really strong run out on Switch and Switch 2 with a lavish remake of its premier and most beloved title and a mega budget new title on the system. For whatever reasons, neither title seems to have managed to tap into the Switch effect that bolstered other series, including Metroid's 2D series, to record heights. Now, there are plenty of reasons to think that Retro might go back to Metroid Prime still, or another title where they once worked their magic, Donkey Kong Country, and many a person has dreamt of them getting their hands on Star Fox or F-Zero or Kid Icarus or something else entirely. But one thing I think is under-discussed is the possibility of Retro Studios coming up with a brand new IP for Nintendo, and that's the focus of this video. Shout out to Tanuki-san7 in the comments for the comment that inspired this video, and without further ado, let's consider why Retro's time to develop a new IP might have finally come. First up, let's remember that Retro has flirted with new projects before. In the early 2000s, the fledgling studio had 4 different projects to show Nintendo, but none of them passed muster, and Miyamoto suggested cannibalizing one of them into becoming a 3D Metroid title, ultimately Metroid Prime. After Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze wrapped up, the studio developed a game called Harmony, builds of which leaked online in recent years. Reportedly, this was an action RPG involving music in some way, but for whatever reason, the title was abandoned fairly late on, and I have seen speculation that this cancellation caused a degree of upset, which is natural since this was evidently quite a long-term project. However, I think the decisions all the way through are easily explainable when you consider Retro's position and Nintendo's studio goals. Nintendo originally purchased Retro Studios during that period of the late 90s when they were all in on power. Their N64 console was so named to make the point that it had double the bits of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, and therefore presumably was twice as good. They'd also had some success with prestige Western titles, like Turok the Dinosaur Hunter, and some of the same developers found themselves at Retro Studios soon after. At the time, this was a pretty solid plan. Of course, the studio, by all reports, was terribly run, and even after the pivot to developing Metroid Prime, Nintendo needed to intervene significantly to resolve a working environment that demanded massive late-stage crunch from the developers. Giving them Metroid made a lot of sense because it was a property Nintendo wanted to do more with, a property which had the potential to be competitive in the West, as Yoshio Sakamoto had found when he visited America in the 80s that the game had quite a positive reputation, as far as his organic encounters showed him. This also meant that Nintendo could put some of their top talent on the game so that Retro's work would be scrutinized much more closely, and on a property where Nintendo had more ability to appraise what worked and what didn't than, for example, in an American football game. With Metroid Prime a huge success, Metroid Primes 2 and 3 were logical follow-ups at the time. We know that there were different pitches, and some of them were leaked over the years, including games in the Zelda and Star Fox series, but ultimately the team was tasked with Donkey Kong Country Returns, and this kind of made sense of Retro at the time as well. With Metroid Prime 3 not having achieved especially strong sales, despite debuting on the higher selling Wii and taking full advantage of the system's unique controls, pivoting to a different property with a stronger sales history and a track record of appealing in the West seemed like a good way to utilize the developer's skills, but without the risks involved of letting them return to the freewheeling experimentalism of the turn of the century. It also kept Kensuke Tanabe and Risa Tabata on board, working with the studio as they had for so many years. And having made one Donkey Kong Country with strong success, a sequel to double down on everything they'd learned only made sense, and so of course we got Tropical Freeze. By the time Tropical Freeze was released, though, Retro was in a different place again, and we know that ultimately they went on to work on an original IP, Harmony. Now, I've covered in a separate video how Retro may have changed considerably during this period as a result of Nintendo's weakened situation during the mid-2010s. While president at the time Satoru Iwata had committed to not shed development staff, he didn't say anything about going on massive recruitment sprees, and the number of staff at Nintendo and likely at Retro did gradually decrease across the middle of the 2010s through the natural process of people leaving. This likely made Retro progressively less able to mount a full-scale original game, and the ultimate cancellation of Harmony was likely, it strikes me, a judgment that the project wasn't worth putting the money behind to take it to completion. However, that's not to say that I think Nintendo regret trying. The fact is, if you look at the mid-2010s, the company had come off a very successful streak with innovative products like the DS and the Wii, but had failed to replicate the same success on the hardware side with the Wii U and 3DS. It appears that they were really keen to do what they had successfully managed to do with Nintendogs, Brain Training, Wii Sports, Wii Fit, and a little further back Animal Crossing, and develop new properties that would appeal to completely different audiences. It stands to reason that not all such innovative projects actually got made, and Harmony was evidently just one of these, but we can tell a lot from the ones that did come to fruition. Splatoon, ARMS, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, and Labo, each a product of one of their most innovation-focused development groups, except for Rabbids, which was, of course, a collaboration. Kaiser McDonald's recent book on Nintendo indicates that for Splatoon, 70 different groups were assembled, and everybody at Nintendo had experience of pitching independently an idea that would be shot down before ultimately having something accepted. Even the teams working on Nintendo's most venerable franchises were going for originality. Mario Maker was a brand new take on 2D Mario. Breath of the Wild was a reinvention of the Zelda formula, and Super Mario Odyssey was the first sandbox Mario since Sunshine, and during the production of which, reportedly, the team subdivided into tiny groups to each work on new gameplay concepts. Here's the thing. Even if you didn't like Labo, and even though Harmony seemed to fail, the strategy clearly more than achieved its objectives overall. Splatoon alone, a massive new breakout IP, was worth doing things new, and the original twists on Mario and Zelda also turned out to be strong successes. Now, in the Switch era, Nintendo seemed to have pivoted towards more conservative approaches to its key properties. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom followed the Breath of the Wild convention strongly despite adding new elements on top of it. So too Metroid Dread, Metroid Prime 4, Paper Mario, WarioWare, Tomodachi Life, Famicom Detective Club, Brain Training, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and Splatoon 3. I'm not saying there aren't new elements in these games, but they're not as radical a reinvention as some of the properties during the past decade. And I think that's because Nintendo knew that their core games were strong, and they knew that bringing these experiences to an audience who would experience them as new on a hardware with much greater reach than all but their most successful prior consoles would be a safe strategy. If anything, the innovations they did take on seem to have largely had mixed receptions, particularly in the case of Metroid Prime 4. Moreover, it was just sensible to exploit surefire hits that would consolidate their advantage and, frankly, exploit the huge demand for Nintendo content rather than confuse people with eccentric innovations at that stage. They also wanted to double down on their core IP at this point in order to have the strongest negotiating hand for their newfound IP strategy in the movie and theme park and merchandising space. Obviously, Mario was a clearly successful brand, but they must have had far more leverage for the Zelda film as a result of the success of Breath of the Wild and their constant pushing of Zelda over the last decade, and it's clear they wanted to do the same for other properties, hoping to ride the Switch effect. Still, eventually Nintendo is going to run out of properties that can really hit that kind of size, and there's a real risk of fatigue. Especially on systems where the previous titles are backwards compatible, how far can they really continue to release new versions of old titles? Mario Tennis Fever has a long way to go to top Mario Tennis Aces, and this might be a sign of other difficulties ahead. Now that Nintendo has expanded to be able to continue servicing its core audience with classic games, they are surely looking at new IP once again, so that if and when the Switch and its libraries start to seem old hat, they can continue to surprise and delight. I cover in a separate video the state of their original IP development right now, and I suspect the back half of this decade will see a considerable increase in these initiatives. But let's consider Retro Studios specifically right now. Retro is vastly different now than when it made Harmony and Donkey Kong Country, let alone the original Metroid Prime games. Metroid Prime 4 received criticisms in many cases, but the parts of the game people take against, the bike, the desert, the soldiers, the ending, are almost exclusively initiatives from Kensuke Tanabe in Japan. Even in the most critical responses to the game, I have seen nothing but praise for the game's art, controls, polish, and so on. They have recruited a team who are, by all accounts, exceptionally well regarded, and now they're at a crossroads. Continuing with Metroid Prime would make some sense. They surely must have unfinished business after Metroid Prime 4's rocky and distended development and poor reception. But there's an obvious sales ceiling to these games. Metroid Prime 2 Remastered would be unlikely to top Metroid Prime Remastered even in terms of sales, and in any event, it's a less well-received title to start with. Metroid Prime 5 has the potential to impress, especially if they can take on board some of the criticisms from Prime 4, but it could just end up cannibalizing the sales of the existing two titles on the system. Pivoting to Donkey Kong Country does seem plausible, especially if Retro is now in a position to mount a second team in parallel to an ongoing development operation of a different kind. But what if they sought to do something different entirely? Something brand new? What if Retro Studios created their own IP? This is, after all, why the company was acquired in the first place. Turok was important for Nintendo's strategy at the time, but it's still the case that Nintendo wants to be able to compete in the Western gaming space. That's not to say it's their absolute top priority, of course. In the last couple of decades, they've evidently had other fish to fry, and especially with their blue ocean strategy. But now that they have carved out a significant part of the gaming landscape for Switch and Switch 2, their new properties, by definition, need to explore hitherto underdeveloped parts of their library. Splatoon evolved into their attempt at a competitive third-person shooter. Mario Maker had at least a little bit of Minecraft DNA in there, but if Nintendo wants to expand their gaming operation, they will want to try and make their pitch for a prestige Western game. Now, consider Retro Studios. As the developers of Metroid Prime, there's a ceiling, quite a low ceiling, on what they can achieve in terms of bringing in money to Nintendo. Last year, I did some very rough and ready back-of-envelope style cost estimates. I reckoned 150 core members of staff, although the Metroid Prime 4 credits suggest it's a little less, and I assumed an average of $100,000 per staff member per year to keep them employed. Although obviously there are lots of other costs involved with employing somebody, so I added a third for taxes, premises security, and other overheads, and estimated that Retro costs about $20 million a year to keep on the road. That might not be the best estimate at all, but it's a very rough starting point. Obviously, there are many other costs associated with making a game, especially from the large number of support studios Retro required as it scaled up, as well as marketing, but just factoring in Retro's costs, if they can sell 2.5 million copies of a game worth about $40 per title going to Nintendo, which feels plausible with more digital purchasing and higher retail prices, that comes to $100 million. So a Metroid Prime every 3 years is doable, but highly unambitious, and of course 2.5 billion in sales will be high for the Prime series, so it does feel like unless Nintendo can do something massive to bolster the Metroid Prime series into another league of sales, they will be developing the Prime games as a loss leader if they go forward with more Samus action. However, Nintendo also needs to recruit and keep talent. US developers tend to be far more willing to chop and change than Japanese staff, and especially Nintendo staff. And Nintendo, of all companies, know better than most that the chopping and changing of personnel is hugely expensive. However well regarded Metroid Prime is in the industry, and Beyond may or may not have dented their reputation, it's hard to imagine that every top developer would want to stay on Metroid indefinitely. And while there are many other properties Nintendo has to offer, there's perhaps something that offers even more prestige, something completely original. How many studios really offer developers the chance to truly branch out and do original work, especially without the threat of abrupt closures and layoffs so common in the game industry? Even more than that, how many studios offer that with the added benefit of Nintendo's vast experience in perfecting games at their disposal? If Nintendo did reposition Retro Studios as its boutique AAA Western game studio for original titles, it's perfectly possible to imagine that they could continue to tempt in a lot of extremely talented developers, and perhaps just as importantly, to keep them and build a long-term productive relationship. After all, the kind of people Nintendo want are likely to have already accepted when they took the job that they will be working with less powerful technology, so for people of that mindset, unless they aspire to work on a specific IP, are offered a massive payday, or need to relocate for other reasons, it's very difficult to imagine a much better offer than the one that could be offered by Nintendo at Retro. Except, perhaps, in one respect. Currently, Nintendo doesn't have much of a presence in this space. Just as Metroid Prime was a low return venture, so could this new game be. But that doesn't have to be the case. Breath of the Wild proves that Nintendo can make breakout games that sell tens of millions, and with the higher profile of that series in the West through the Zelda film, it's a perfect opportunity for Nintendo to try to demonstrate that they too can create original works that capture the imagination of a slightly different audience in the same way. Moreover, Nintendo is willing to play the long game. Even if the Switch 2 never ultimately secures the market penetration into the more high-end gaming space to make an original game of this kind a big success, Nintendo can be patient. Animal Crossing, Pikmin, Splatoon, many of their top properties started in obscurity, often on systems which didn't have an install base of players that were ready for the games. Being too early to the party isn't the worst problem in the world if you can afford to have patience to wait for the right moment, and patience is one thing Nintendo prioritizes being able to afford. And this has a significant impact on the cost-benefit analysis of retro studios for Nintendo. Let's say Nintendo keeps scaling them up and we factor in inflationary wage increases, so the company is costing 30 million a year to keep afloat pretty soon. Let's also say that their development pace slows considerably, prototypes that don't pass muster, trials that turn out to be errors, plus the huge time sink of AAA game development. Maybe they produce one AAA game every 10 years. Even if they're still making $40 a copy, Nintendo would now need to sell, at minimum, 7.5 million units of their new game, not counting all the other ancillary costs, such as marketing, localization, and support, that would make 10 million at least a break-even point. Well, that's unlikely. Even on Switch, which did bigger numbers than most, very few titles reached this threshold. The original Wii U versions of Splatoon and Zelda Breath of the Wild came nowhere close. But Splatoon 2 and Zelda Breath of the Wild on the Switch both did. And it's not exactly inconceivable that a major Nintendo title could do massive numbers, or perhaps be produced in a smaller production window and therefore be much more affordable going forward. And a flop out of the gate isn't necessarily such an issue either. If they think the game does truly have merit, Nintendo will be able to profit off it indefinitely through re-releases, plus they can often cannibalize elements and sell them again. Labo didn't do exceptionally well, but through Game Builder Garage and the Virtual Boy cardboard kit, it is still proving valuable to them. And now that Nintendo has a direct line to Hollywood, the potential upside in terms of a movie option is even higher. And this is all assuming that Nintendo put all their chips on an original title. Realistically, the studio is probably large enough to have multiple core game design groups, and then to utilize temporary hires and assist studios like Iron Galaxy and others to help keep multiple projects on the road. Nintendo may want to keep Metroid Prime ticking along so that the institutional memory of making the games isn't completely degraded, a problem they faced to a significant degree with Donkey Kong in Country Returns and Bonanza, but Metroid Prime doesn't need and probably can't sustain multiple games a generation. They may well feel that they'd rather keep pushing beyond and remastered for most of this generation, giving plenty of time for Risa Tabata to rethink the conventions of the property, ready for a bold new take with Prime 5. I think it's very unlikely that Beyond is the last Prime game, and I think it's equally unlikely that it will be the last Prime game Retro work on, but just like EPD10 kept their hand in with Pikmin while prioritizing 2D Mario games through the 2000s and 2010s, I could see Metroid Prime being a secondary consideration, returning maybe 10 or 12 years hence. And of course, there's nothing to say that an original title can't turn back into something enriching a core IP. Thought was given to whether the game that became Splatoon would suit Mario characters. Nintendo starts with the core concepts first, so if they ultimately decide that the game will do better as a Zelda or Star Fox or heck even Star Tropics title, then they will doubtless take whatever Retro is doing and give it that twist. Multiple people have mused that Harmony seems like it could have worked very well with Donkey Kong and Pauline from Bonanza, and perhaps without the same budget pressures and with fresh eyes, Retro will be able to resurrect that into something powerful and new. But it strikes me that the real power move here is probably to become a home for truly original, high-end, Western developed projects. Looked at in isolation, this might seem risky or even unwise, but Nintendo relies on new IPs and new breakthrough initiatives to sustain itself, and it strikes me that Retro Studios have the potential to be a really solid, long-term bet on this front. I'll return to a more holistic review and forecast of Retro Studios' future, hopefully when we have more solid sales data from the 25 to 26 financial year. But for now, let me just plug the Patreon, which has early, exclusive, and ad-free content. Thank you very much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.